Everyone, how are you? Yeah. I wanted to check in with everybody. How was your last week? Were you able to spend those 10 minutes every morning in scripture and prayer? I know some of you have jumped in. I can see the smiles on your face. But maybe you skipped a day. Maybe that one day became 2 days. Maybe you started to hear a voice in your head that said, see, you can't even do 10 minutes. You're never going to change. It's pointless. I was thinking those words, and when I thought them on something, it was when I started to go jogging and running 7 or 8 years ago. And I did what's called a couch to 5K program. So the idea is get off the couch and get outside. So first thing it says is, oh, you need to go jog for 3 minutes and then walk for 3 minutes. Well, that was the first despair right there, jogging for 3 minutes. So what I decided to do is I said, I'm going to jog to the next mailbox. My mailboxes are about 30, 40 yards apart. So I jogged for 30 yards, and then I would walk. And then the despair would hit. I'm like, I've got to jog again. Well, eventually I was able to push through that, and I was able to keep jogging. And instead of just going to one mailbox, I was able to go to 2 mailboxes. And then I could go 3 mailboxes. Before you know it, I jogged an entire mile without stopping. But every time I had to push myself. I had to ignore those thoughts in my head and says, it's okay if you walk. I had to ignore that voice. Well, that voice, it has a name. It's called despair. And I want you to notice something. It shows up fast when we try to do something new that we haven't done in a while. You see, we make this commitment to spend time with God, to draw closer to Him, and then almost immediately, that voice whispers that it won't work. And that's not an accident. That's actually a strategy, because despair is sneaky, and it disguises itself as honesty. It says, hey, Todd, just be realistic. You can't get to the next mailbox. And it looks like this in all of our circumstances. In those dry seasons of our soul, when the prayers that we're saying just seem like they're just bouncing off the ceiling, they come right back to us. When the situations in our life just never get better. And I think it writes an ending for us. Despair does. It writes a confident, certain, doom-filled ending. And it does this before we ask God what He thinks in our lives. And I think we've all been there, if we're honest. We don't just worry about something sometimes, do we? We've already played the whole movie out in our head. You already know how it ends. And it never ends well. And the trouble is, when we're doing that, we're making a theological mistake. We've written God out of the script. Let's go back to our Numbers, our Old Testament reading, Numbers chapter 13. This is, I think, one of the most heartbreaking moments in all of the Old Testament. The Israelites have left Egypt. They've been traveling around the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, and they're at the edge of everything that God has promised them. 12 spies are sent out to look into the land of Canaan, and they walk the same ground. All 12 of them do. And they see the same thing. And what they see is stunning. The land is exactly how God said it would be. It's filled with milk and honey. They bring back a cluster of grapes, and it's so heavy it takes 2 of them to carry on a pole, showing the bounty that's available there. What happens next, though? 10 of those spies, they come back and they give what the Bible calls is an evil report. And I thought, well, that's weird. You see, the land was real. The giants that are in that land are real. The fortified cities are real. But then they add something. They make it up. They stand next to these people that made them feel like insects. And they assume the giants felt the same about them. You see, what they did is they projected their fear about the people that they never spoke to. And then that fear spread throughout the camp. They were so full of despair, but they wanted to go back to Egypt and become slaves again. This is what despair does. It takes real circumstances that we have in our lives, and it adds a catastrophic ending that is invented. And it always writes out God. Caleb was with those 10. He's one of the other two. Caleb had the same data. He walked all that land. He stands up and he says, we are well able. Caleb didn't say the giants weren't real, because they were. But Caleb's math added God. Whereas the 10 spies, their math did not include any of God. Caleb had faith. Psalm 103, verse 2. The psalmist knows the pull of that despair that happens in our lives. And his answer isn't just think positively, but instead, we need to hold fast on the promises of God. He says, bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. Forget not. You see, the psalmist is commanding his own soul, his own emotions, his own fears, to remember what God has done. He reminds himself that God forgives, God heals, God is a redeemer. He crowns us with a steadfast love and mercy. God does not deal with us for the sins that we've committed. So the antidote to despair is not pretending the giants are not there. It's remembering who God is. It's doing what Caleb did, running the same numbers, but adding God to the equation. And this is why those 10 minutes you're spending every day in Scripture and praying, this is why it's more important than you may even realize. Because when you open up the Scriptures every day, you're doing exactly what the psalmist is doing. You're rehearsing who God is before that despair gets a chance to rehearse your fears for you. You're getting God's voice first. And that's not a small thing, church. That's how we fight. James chapter 4, verse 15 says something that's almost counterintuitive here. James doesn't say, don't worry about the future. He adds 4 words to your plans. This is what James recommends. He says, if the Lord wills. Now, that's not fatalism, and it's not being passive. It's saying, have an open hand. A posture that says, I'm not going to grip the future in fear. I'm not going to grab it in pride. I'm going to hand it back to God. Jesus says the same thing a little bit differently in our gospel reading today. Don't be anxious about tomorrow. Seek first the kingdom. Today, you have enough. One day at a time. 10 minutes at a time. This is our Lenten rhythm this season. Not solving everything, not trying to see everything into the future, just being faithful today in the strength that God gives you today, trusting the God who holds tomorrow. Now, we're 5 weeks away from Easter. And you can remember what the disciples of Jesus faced when they walked the very first Lent. The disciples on Good Friday were the 10 spies on their worst day. You see, the disciples saw the giants win. They watched the tomb close And they wrote the ending themselves in their mind. They said, it's over. We were wrong. He's gone. And then Sunday comes. Despair was not the last word. The empty tomb was. Whatever giants are standing between you and your life with God has promised, whether it's your marriage, your health, your faith, your finances, the resurrection says that God is not finished. Caleb in Numbers says he is well able. What God starts, God completes. So this week, here's my challenge. You might have heard it before. 2 simple things. Keep those 10 minutes. Don't let a missed day become a missed week. If you fell off, today is the day you get back on. God's mercies are new every morning. Now that's not a cliche. That's Lamentations chapter 3. Start tomorrow fresh. And when despair starts whispering its ugly words into your head, I want you to ask one question. Is God in this story that I'm writing in my mind? Because if God's not in the story, you haven't written the whole story yet. In a few minutes, we're going to celebrate communion together. And this is one of our means of grace that John Wesley teaches us, right? This is how we stay in love with God, is celebrating communion. I also want you to know what communion is for. It's for people who missed their 10 minutes. Maybe someone here is feeling some despair. Maybe you don't have your faith perfectly in order. Communion is for those people that are still on their journey. People who've made a commitment last week and they're still fighting to keep it. People who have heard that voice of despair this week and they needed reminded that God says is true. When you come forward this morning, I want you to come with open hands. Not clenched in fear, not grasping for control, but open. Because this bread and cup, they're the answer to every catastrophic ending that you've written in your own mind. Jesus says, I gave up my earthly life so you wouldn't stay broken. Jesus says, I poured myself out so that you could be filled. The same Jesus that walked out of the tomb is the one who meets us today at the table. Surrender your despair. Receive his hope.